January, a group of us from a few different seminaries visited on the border, on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border, from Atlanta and a seminary in Lexington, Kentucky. And this was actually my second trip. We were visiting with an organization called Borderlinks that does education and advocacy around border and immigration issues. And this was my second visit with that group. And I think what struck me coming now 2 years after my first visit was the kinds of transitions, the kinds of differences that I saw in the people that we met, particularly who were crossing from Mexico. One of the more powerful visits, both times that I've been, was to a community called Altar, where we visited a migrant shelter and also spent some time in the main plaza of that town, visiting and just talking with migrants or would-be migrants. And that is a town that's kind of in the middle of nowhere and has really been transformed by the issue of migration. And in fact, its primary industry now is migration. If you look around the plaza in that town, there's all of these stands of backpacks and appropriate clothing for crossing, and telephone stands, and sort of hostels for immigrants to stay in. And its entire industry, its entire life is kind of dependent now on the business of migration, which is an interesting transition to see over the last several years. But in talking with some of primarily men who were planning to cross, hearing really different stories than I had heard a couple of years ago. Whereas a couple of years ago, people may have been crossing for the first time, were kind of the typical story that you hear. We're looking for work, we're looking to stay maybe a number of months, maybe a year. A number of the men I spoke to had been in the U.S. for several years, in large part not because they went there intending to stay, but because they knew if they'd come back, what a risk it would be to try to cross again. Both a risk in terms of the increased vigilance on the border and from Border Patrol and immigration, and that they would be forced into more desolate areas to cross. And so the physical risks of that, but also that even if they were to get to a place where they could find work to get back to their families or friends that they had in the U.S., that the level of crackdown on immigration in the U.S. was such that that they really feared for their safety. If they had come and spent a number of years in the U.S., you know, it was often the case that they had started families here. And so just thinking about the issues of if they were to be deported, that then, you know, what is the likelihood that they would stay in Mexico? You know, if they have wives, children in the U.S., that the system that we have in place is really not responding to the reality. What is the likelihood that they would stay?